All right, Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
All right, a wonderful, blessed Sabbath day today. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and mention this. I didn't plan this, but it's funny because, at the end, we've been at this whole Galatians series, right at the end, I always try to offer some sort of practical insight, right? This idea that, well, we can learn, we'll sit and listen and we'll learn and we'll build up knowledge and that's great. But knowledge for knowledge's sake doesn't do anything. Knowledge for knowledge's sake doesn't have an impact in this world. It doesn't change or refine us individually. Right? Knowledge for knowledge's sake most often leads to hypocrisy. So we've been trying to keep an eye towards what are we doing with what we're learning towards the end of each teaching each week. Now, it can be a little bit challenging at times, right? Just because sometimes we've only read just a couple verses, and you got to wonder, what do I do with this? So there's a bit of a challenge involved at times. But at the end of today, and we'll get there at the end of today, I'm going to have a particular thing to highlight from the readings today. And it's funny because you actually touched on it right at the end of what you were just talking about. For those that may be joining just right now, or maybe didn't catch Aaron's Torah portion coverage, make sure you go back and watch that. Right at the very end, right? Being a servant. Yeah, it'll make more sense when we wrap up today. But with that, we are going to continue with Galatians today, much to the surprise of no one, I'm sure. As you will hopefully recall, we've spent the last few weeks, I keep saying few weeks, it's months now. Let's be real. The last few weeks at least, just in chapter 3, right? So the first week we covered an intro, then we covered chapter 1. The second week we covered half of chapter 2, and then the next half. And since then, we've been stuck in chapter 3. And I say stuck not in a bad way. It's been slow going. It's been a slow process because there's a lot of material to cover. There's a lot of very important things that Paul talks about in Galatians 3. Important things for us to know, important things for us to be sure of, but also important things for us not to conflate. Right along the way, and we'll talk about it again today. But we've been careful to define what the Torah is for and what the Torah is not for. And that's a large portion of what Paul is getting at in Galatians. It is not his anti-law polemic, as so many have said that it is. In Galatians, Paul's very clear that law is done. That law is obsolete. That's not what he says. At no point does he say that. In fact, he says the opposite, as we're going to review here in just a minute. Galatians is not Paul's anti-law polemic. It is Paul's clarification that the law was never meant to be your savior. It's Paul's clarification on what the Torah wasn't supposed to do because these false teachers had come in and had begun saying that certain specific types of law keeping, the things bound up in ritualistic conversion, those things guarantee you your salvation. That's really what we've been talking about. So we've spent the last few weeks now going through chapter 3 pretty slowly. And as you can see on the slide, we're wrapping up chapter 3 today, and that's all we're going to be covering today. So this message might be a little bit shorter than prior weeks, but mostly because I didn't want to jump into chapter 4 and then only get just 2 verses in before we're at our time today. I would rather spend 35 to 40 minutes over 3 weeks covering this chapter than try to fit it all in 1 hour. I mean? All right. So once again, the reason that we're going through Galatians at such a slow pace is because it contains some of the most difficult passages. In particular, chapter 3, and really 3 and 4 contain some really challenging passages. Not because Paul's words are wrong, but because the interpretation of Paul's words has been influenced, I think, unduly against the Torah. So we've looked at most of these passages in depth each time as we've come to them each week, and we will continue to do that throughout this series. Today we'll be continuing to do that as we begin our journey with verse 26. But really quick, I want to reiterate the last bit that we went over last week. And this touches on the guardian, right? The guardian or the tutor that Paul speaks of as he relates the law to its function as a tutor or guardian. It also bears repeating verse 21 that we covered last week as well. So to just sort of bridge our teachings, I try to do that. I try to form this bridge where we connect what we went over last time with what we're going over this time, just to make sure that people are continuing to connect these concepts. Now, it's easy enough to say, well, just go back and rewatch the videos, but most people won't. And I understand that's a realistic expectation. Nobody wants to see me say the same thing over and over and over again. I don't even go back and rewatch me over and over and over again, so I wouldn't expect someone else to. So I do try to give a couple minutes of this sort of bridge between what we're going to be covering today and what we went over previously. So once again, verse 21, we're going to reread that. As we started with last week, we covered a bit of that last week, and we're going to read through verse 25. Should come up. Hopefully it's readable. If not, I also expect that everyone has their Bible. Everybody has a Bible, right? If you have a smartphone, you have a Bible. So no excuses. No excuses. All right, Galatians 3:21. Then is the Torah against the promises of God? May it never be. Now, the TLV and actually a number of Bibles put an exclamation point here. Some will say, certainly not. Right? May it never be. Now, there's no exclamation point in the Greek text. There's no exclamation point that Paul wrote here. So how do we know? Because the language and the terminology he uses is that of emphasis. He's emphasizing this point. Certainly not. He uses this phrase numerous times. Right? Do we then nullify the law because certainly not, may it never be, right? The emphasis is Paul's, not the translators. The emphasis is Paul's, that this is a very important point. The Torah is not contrary to the promises of God. He continues, for if a law had been given that could impart life, certainly righteousness would have been based on law. But the Scripture has locked up the whole world under sin so that the promise based on trust in Messiah Yeshua might be given to those who trust. Now, again, I related last week that I believe what he's actually saying here, if we can understand the phrase somewhat differently, is that the promise based on the faithfulness of Messiah is given to those who are faithful to the Messiah, right? The faithfulness of Yeshua, it is his work, his accomplishment. Amen. Verse 23, now before faith came, we were being guarded under Torah, bound together until the coming faith would be revealed. Therefore, the Torah became our guardian to lead us to Messiah, so that we might be made right based on trusting. But now that faith has come, we are no longer under a guardian. Here once again in verse 21, Paul says, as I said, may it never be. And that's exactly what he means. He is saying, may it never be thought that the Torah is contrary to the promises of God. And I keep repeating that because it bears repeating. Paul doesn't teach that the law is contrary to trusting in God for salvation. Rather, Paul is teaching that trusting in one's self, one's own law-keeping for salvation, that is contrary to the promise of God. Because then it's not, as he says a couple weeks ago, it's not based on God's promise if you can work your way into it. And the basis of God's covenant is the promise he made to Abraham. So his contrast here is those who are of faith, those that trust in God, those that know salvation comes from the completed work of Messiah. This, is what he's saying, stands in contrast to those who do not trust in God but trust in themselves. Well, I went through these rituals, I converted, therefore God is now obligated to save me. That's the contrast Galatians is drawing. These are the ones that he says are of the law. Not that being holding to the law is a bad thing. Not that being observant of the law is a bad thing. But trusting in the law for your salvation pits you against the gospel, which the core truth of which is trusting in God for salvation provided through the Son. So we see Paul's issue is not with keeping the Torah. His issue is with trying to make the Torah into something it was never meant to be. Back to verse 23, as we examined last week, Paul compares the Torah to a guardian, right? It's worth pointing out this passage here is so commonly used to say that the law is no longer obligatory for believers today, right? You've probably heard it quoted this way. See, Paul says the law was a guardian that was only necessary until Messiah comes, and now that Messiah has come, we no longer need that guardian, which is the law. But Paul never says we do not need the law, does he? That's not his actual words. That's inserting a traditional interpretation into the text. No, what Paul says is that we no longer need the guardian function of the law, right? And then we'll get into that in just a moment. That's not to say that the Torah is not for us today. That's not to say that it's not obligatory for believers. That's not to say that we should not be keeping the commandments. That is to say that the function of the law in this particular way finds its end, its goal, when one comes to Messiah. So I mentioned that last week, but we didn't really go in depth because of time. So instead I'm going to do that today. And like I said, I think this will help bridge us through the end of this chapter well. So with that, we'll start by asking, what exactly is this guardian or tutor? Again, depending on your translation. I mentioned last week that there's a whole historical side of this, a lot of background information to this word in particular that you miss by just simply reading an English translation of your Bible. So for the next couple minutes, I'm going to describe for you what this guardian or tutor is so that you get a better picture, a better understanding. I've got a couple quotes that I'll read from here so that you understand this isn't just me saying, hey, here's what this guardian is based on my interpretation. We're going to do this linguistically, right? We're going to do this exegetically. We're going to do this based on the Greek word itself, the word that Paul chose, not my interpretation of it, not my translation of it, not the New American Standards Committee translation of it. Amen? I want you to see that this is a well-documented position, this word, this guardian, right? It's a role or position that is well-documented, that existed in first century culture. In Greek, the word is pedagogos. That's a funny word, isn't it? Pedagogos. You may have actually heard the word pedagogue before, right? In different translations, you'll find it rendered differently. The New American Standard renders it as guardian, just like the Tree of Life does, as do the ESV and the Net Bible, and the Lexham English Bible, and the NIV. However, the English Revised Version and the New King James render it as tutor. The Complete Jewish Bible says custodian, as does the Common English Bible. Right? The Complete Jewish says custodian. I'm not entirely sure why. For those of you that may recall this from the Old King Jimmy, and even older versions like the Geneva Bible, this was rendered as schoolmaster. Schoolmaster. Remember that? All of these sound kind of similar, right? Tutor, schoolmaster, I can see the connection. Tutor, guardian, okay, I can kind of see how that relates. However, the New Revised Standard sort of bucks the trend here. It renders this as disciplinarian. The law became our disciplinarian. That has a whole different connotation to it, doesn't it? Now, in all of these different versions, you don't really necessarily think a whole lot about it, right? A translation of guardian, tutor, custodian, these all sound kind of like the type of person, and maybe they're, your babysitter, your private tutor, because maybe you were homeschooled and your parents hired a tutor or something. You kind of get these sort of inferences from it, right? A private instructor, something like that. That's how we tend to think of a tutor in our culture, after all, right? But none of these really stand out that much. Schoolmaster invokes a certain image, especially for those of you that remember back when schools had someone called a schoolmaster. And that may be more relevant now still for our English friends across the pond. A lot of times they still have a schoolmaster, right? We don't use such terms in the U.S. anymore for offensive reasons I won't go into. But in all of these translations, right, none of them adequately convey the background information of this word. Does any of this tell you what this word meant to the first century reader? No. You get images in your head, as I said, of a private tutor, someone that works for the school system, maybe a bodyguard for your kid, even a babysitter, but it doesn't tell you what they actually did in the first century. And that's not the fault of translators, to be fair. They're tasked with translating more than they are explaining. Right? So unless you're going to produce something like the Amplified Bible with a lot of additional words to explain the background and the context, there really isn't a good English equivalent for this word. This is where the strength of a study Bible comes in, but even then, the footnotes and margins only provide so much space. So to the word at hand, pedagogos. There it is. Because I used a heading, it actually put it in all caps. Pretty much no Greek Bible would write it this way unless you're reading an Alexandrian text. That gets off track. Pedagogos, right? In all of the New Testament, this word appears only 3 times. Each time, Paul uses it. 2 of those times is right here, verses 24 and 25 of Galatians. The only other time that this word appears is in 1 Corinthians 4:15. But we're not going to go there and look at that. Pardon me. We're not going to go there and look at the context in 1 Corinthians 4:15 because that really gets us off track. But we are going to, as I said, we're going to get the definition of this word. We're going to get the background information on it. So I will read from a couple dictionaries here. The first one is from the New International Dictionary of New Testament Theology and Exegesis. I know, that's a mouthful. The short definition of the word is given as to bring up, instruct, train, educate, discipline, that sort of thing. You see this idea, right? Instruct, train, discipline, educate. Okay. These are all these words that are associated with this term in Greek. The full entry from the New International Dictionary of New Testament Theology and Exegesis, I got through it twice. It contains the following. This, again, quote, "This word group, attested as early as the 7th century BC, derives from the noun pais, or paidos, which is child, right? Both paiduo and paideia originally had to do with the training of children, including the process of education and development of culture, which the sophists of the 5th century declared to be the chief aim of their work. Later, the terms were extended to cover adult education as well, being used generally of scientific training, and the noun paideia could be applied to the result of education, thus learning, or even contextually, culture. You learned culture. That's an interesting thought, isn't it? Many derivatives were subsequently coined. The term paidagogos, once again, the word in question here, referring to someone, usually a slave, who was in charge of a child's training, is found already in Euripides and Herodotus. And this gives us part of what we want to know, but I have one more boring dictionary entry to read for you. This is from the Exegetical Dictionary of the New Testament. It says, the substantive paidagogos is attested from Euripides and Herodotus. We just heard that. And was a common loan word in rabbinic usage. There's a fun one for you. That's a homework assignment if you want one. It is found in the New Testament only in Galatians 3, verses 24 and 25, and 1 Corinthians 4, 15. In accordance with its etymology, it means child leader, and designates in the world of the New Testament that man, usually of the slave class, who is in charge of the external education, conduct, courtesy, table manners, and general deportment of boys of about 6 to 16 years of age. The paidagogos was distinguished from the teacher, or didaskalos. Thus, the paidagogos should be understood as a supervisor or disciplinarian. The NRSV makes a little more sense now, doesn't it? So what was this guardian, this tutor, this disciplinarian expected to teach the child in his care? It wasn't philosophy. It wasn't theology. It wasn't even really the core of morality. He was expected to teach proper conduct, table manners, common courtesy, how you behave. Today we'd say, minding your P's and Q's, right? Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. Right? Don't be obscene. Shake hands. Thank them for their time. Hold the door open for somebody that's coming in, right? What we call good manners, this is what this person was expected to instill in those under his charge. The outward matters. Do you see where this is going? As part of this, as we have seen in this definition, this was not a permanent role. The child would eventually graduate out from under the supervisory care of the paidagogos. Okay? And what happens when the child achieves a certain age is that's when maturity comes, right? You come of age, as we read, about age 6 to 16, usually from the time that the child was weaned from his nurse, is what another dictionary said. See, I didn't throw a third dictionary in there. That's too much. While there can certainly be a negative aspect of this, right? There is the harsh or strict disciplinarian. Some commentators focus only on that, right? This idea that the guardian was a strict disciplinarian and thus it was harsh. And see, since Paul says the law is that way, we get rid of it because it was harsh. It beat us down when we messed up, but we got rid of it, right? And to say that it was harsh and strict at times is not an unfair statement. There are first century letters where someone is complaining about the paidagogos, this guardian or trainer or tutor while he was growing up. Oh, well, he hit me, or these other sorts of things. He was too strict, too harsh. You grew to resent him. Josephus actually speaks about, I believe it was his son that had one, and he was complaining about his tutor. Anyway, so there is a negative aspect that can be seen. However, the guardian was one to whom respect was due, and that was the expectation in culture. Oftentimes in culture, in this position, this person was considered to be a secondary father figure to the child in his care. When the child excelled, when the child did well, was noticed for being exceptional, the guardian, the tutor, was praised for doing a good job. But if the child messed up, the guardian was not so much praised, right? Kind of that judgmental look you give parents now when they're in the supermarket. If their kids are doing really good, you go, they do a great job with those kids. And when the kids are acting up, you're like, somebody, you know? I'm not saying you should do that. I'm just saying we often do that. People be judgmental, all right? The paidagogos was the one who would lead the child to and from the academy, right? Basically, he walked your kid to school, okay? He would protect him from harm along the way. Actually, reading through all of this and preparing for this message, I couldn't help but think of Alfred, Batman's butler, tending to him, keeping an eye on him, right? At times protecting him, being there to help him learn manners, to learn how to interact in a social setting with other people. That's all the stuff that this person was expected to do. So for Paul to use this word, this is the image that he wanted his readers to understand. To consider the Torah as this type of guardian with the intent of being brought to maturity. Okay, you've arrived. Now you're outside of my care, right? That maturity is being recognized as the Messiah. That's what Paul says, right? We're under a guardian until, right? It means that the law's function as a disciplinary guardian is no longer necessary to point you to the one that you now know, right? You could consider it an introduction. Let's say that Aaron invites me to go meet the governor, right? He doesn't know the governor either. But let's say that Aaron knows him and he introduces me. Okay, after he introduces us, we've officially met, right? I no longer need someone to introduce me to him. I already know him. Aaron doesn't become unnecessary or obsolete. He doesn't become useless just because I've already been introduced. But his function in introducing us is no longer necessary, okay? Once again, to reiterate what I mentioned in passing last week, the function of the Torah as this guardian ceased, not the entirety of the Torah and not every function of the Torah. Now, what I think is equally as telling, and I will admit you could call this an argument from silence because it's what Paul did not say, but it's worth noting that he did not use the word didaskalos here. He didn't use the word teacher. The law has become our teacher, so we get to Messiah, we no longer need the law as a teacher. That's not what he said. And Paul uses this word. We know he's familiar with this word. We know he knows this word for teacher, but he doesn't use it. He very carefully selected the term that he wanted the Galatians to understand. Amen. So once again, let's reread these two verses. Galatians 3:24 and 25. Therefore, the Torah became our guardian to lead us to Messiah, so that we might be made right based on trusting. Pause there for a second. The Torah was supposed to be the thing that instructed you and brought you to maturity so that you would understand that faith in Christ is the basis of salvation. Verse 25, but now that faith has come, we are no longer under a guardian. Not, we are no longer under the Torah. Not, we don't need to keep the law anymore. Not, the commandments are obsolete. We don't need this guardian function of the Torah. Now that faith has come, we are no longer under a guardian. The Torah should lead you to Messiah, and it should do this in multiple ways. It does this by defining and highlighting your sin. It does this by informing you that atonement is necessary. It does this by teaching you that death is the result of sin. It does this even in narrative, not just legal commandments. The Exodus narrative, for example, conveys the message that sin is bondage and slavery, and we require a Savior to redeem us from it. Did Israel free themselves from Egypt? No. Immediately following the Exodus from Egypt, God tells the people many times that He brought them out, He delivered them, He saved them. They did not free themselves. They trusted Him, and they followed Him. Amen. The Torah contains prophecies from Genesis through Deuteronomy. The seed of the woman would crush the seed of the enemy. A scepter and lawgiver would come from Judah. A prophet like unto Moses would be raised up among the Israelites. All of these are prophecies which point to the coming of the Messiah. The Torah should point us to Messiah. It should introduce us to Him. Once that happens, the introduction is no longer necessary. Now you know Him. The work of the Torah as one who oversees our walk and conduct coming into maturity, and at time brings strict, harsh discipline, like the curses of the law, is no longer necessary. Because that's what we've been freed from. That's the commonality here in these statements, this strict curse that the Torah brings. By design, God pronounced it. That's what we've been freed from. See, I believe Paul has both ideas in mind. The function of the Torah to instruct, to lead along the way until maturity, as well as the idea of strict correction and harsh discipline. That idea, as we saw from the dictionaries that we read a few moments ago, is all bound up in this word. And this fits with his prior statements, as I said, about the curse of the law. Those who are not of Messiah are not yet freed from the curse, namely death, that the Torah brings for disobedience. This also relates to the topic of spiritual maturity, and perhaps we'll get to that in the future. It should be a whole sermon on its own. At any rate, Paul is clear in his somewhat vague metaphor. The role of Torah as guardian is no longer applicable when one comes to Messiah, but that does not mean the Torah has no role at all. Okay? Now we get to today's verses. Oh, we're just now getting to today's topic, right? Verse 26. For you are all sons of God through trusting in Messiah Yeshua. For all of you who were immersed in Messiah have clothed yourselves with Messiah. There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor free. There is neither male nor female. For you are all one in Messiah Yeshua. And if you belong to Messiah, then you are Abraham's seed, heirs according to the promise. Paul switches here from the plural language of verses 23 to 25, right? It was first person plural. Us, we, our, right? Our guardian, the Torah became. To second person, you. Why does he do that? I believe this is entirely intentional. He wants to make sure his readers understand that they, the non-Jews by birth, are all children of God through faith in Messiah. Because if he says, we are children of God through faith, someone could say, well, but he was a Jew. So see, we have to convert in order to be accepted. No. You, Galatians, ethnic non-Jews, are all children of God through faith in Messiah. This signals Paul's return to a prior point that he made that we saw, the identity of believers. I actually recorded one of my first teachings last year, once we started publicly meeting. The opening of our whole Foundations of Our Faith series was on a believer's identity. I need to redo that one because audio quality was terrible. I've also got some more material to add to it. I digress. But to the passage at hand, Paul is about to herein reiterate what he previously told the Galatian assembly, that it is about who they are in Messiah. He tells them that they are children of God. They were baptized or immersed into Messiah, which I'll explain in a moment. He tells them that they are one together in the body of Messiah. Now this especially would be important for the people of Galatia, who were being told by some group, these influencers, right, that Paul is here arguing against. They were being told they had to become Jews, to ritualistically convert, as God would not accept them as a non-Jew in order to be accepted into covenant, accepted into the body of Messiah. It's very important then, he says, Jew and Gentile, right? One in the body. He then loops back to what he's been saying all along. You don't need this conversion to be considered a child of Abraham, because if you belong to the Messiah, you already are one. As he opened chapter 3, you already knew this, right? You already saw the Spirit's work here. Why are you so foolish as to turn away from it? Here in verse 27, he tells them that they were immersed in Messiah. Most Bibles will say you were baptized into Christ, right? He says that they have clothed themselves with Messiah. That's kind of strange, isn't it? We'll come back to that. Recall from the Foundation series teaching on baptism that we noted that baptism at its core is about symbolically going from death to life. I believe this is similar to what Paul says in chapter 2 of his letter to the Ephesians, where he tells them that they, and that is Gentiles, were without God and without hope in the world. Ephesians 2, 11 to 16. Therefore keep in mind that once you, Gentiles in the flesh, who were called uncircumcision by those called circumcision, performed on flesh by hand, at that time you were separate from Messiah, excluded from the commonwealth of Israel, strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. But now, in Messiah Yeshua, you who were once far off have been brought near by the blood of the Messiah. For he is our shalom, the one who made the two into one and broke down the middle wall of separation. Within his flesh he made powerless the hostility, the law code of commandments contained in regulations. He did this in order to create within himself one new man from the two groups, making peace, shalom, and to reconcile both to God in one body through the cross, by which he put the hostility to death. The division, the enmity, as some translations will say, the hostility. That was the wall that separated Jews from non-Jews, and that has been torn down. We've covered all that before. The wall of separation was broken down, not the Torah. I digress. In Galatians 3, being baptized into Messiah, or immersed into Messiah, is yet again a picture of going from death to life, transitioning from a citizen of the kingdom of this world to a citizen of the kingdom of heaven. But remember that immersion, baptism, actually carried multiple connotations at this time. At its core, it signaled a transition from one phase to another phase, right? Death to life, that's the image. It was commonly used in addition to male circumcision to identify and signify conversion, right? You went from what you were, pagan, Gentile, to a God-fearer, right? Conversion from one thing to another, a period of transition in your life. Of course, there's the aspect of baptism for ritual impurity. You become unclean, you have to immerse, right? You go transition from one state, unclean, to another state, clean. No doubt Paul includes this statement here about being baptized in Messiah as an argument against his detractors, to counter the ideas that the Galatians had to be baptized and have that recognized by Jewish teachers in order to be allowed into the covenant. Because once again, immersion and circumcision, those are the two signs for conversion to Judaism in the first century. And actually that continues even to today. But each of these meanings are connected. First, the physical is cleansing for impurities, getting rid of the things that are associated with death. Right? When one transitions from one phase of life into another, especially as it relates to coming to faith and joining with the God of Israel, one must shed the impure things, the things connected to death. And in the Jewish mind of the first century, because of their pagan practices, Gentiles were naturally impure. They were in need of cleansing before being allowed into God's covenant community. Part of this, and because of the social connections and the cultural context, it is not incorrect to say that immersion is a sort of initiation rite, right? We know that Paul similarly viewed it this way from 1 Corinthians 10, starting at verse 1. For I do not want you to be ignorant, brothers and sisters, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea. They were all immersed into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they were drinking from a spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Messiah. Immersed into Moses pertains being initiated into the covenant. Relating this back to Galatians, then, Paul viewed these very same people to which he was speaking as having already been initiated into, already brought into fellowship with God, brought into the covenant. Additionally, we have the following verses from Romans 6, verse 3. Or do you not know that all of us who were immersed into Messiah Yeshua were immersed into his death? Therefore, we were buried together with him through immersion into death, in order that just as Messiah was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, so too we might walk in newness of life. This is, I think, the most blatant reference to immersion relating to going from death to life, as far as it pertains to the practice of baptism. When it comes to being clothed with Messiah, I think there are a couple things here to note. First, there is, in my opinion, a relation to the practice of immersion itself, right? For Jews, going into an immersion pool, right, a mikvah, as we say, when you'd go immerse, there couldn't be anything on you. No clothes, no swimming trunks, right? This isn't going swimming. This is a cleansing ritual bath. One would be completely naked. It fits then with Paul's usage to say that one is immersed into Messiah and then clothed with Messiah, right? This completes the metaphorical usage, the image of being immersed and rising and being dressed anew, clean, fresh, the newness of life, right? But I think there's more to his usage here than just that. I think he's using this physical image to convey something else. Being clothed with something was a well-known idiomatic phrase for taking on certain qualities. For example, Isaiah 52:1, Zion is told to clothe yourself in strength, right? Awake, awake, clothe yourself in strength, Zion. Clothe yourself in beautiful garments, Jerusalem, the holy city, for the uncircumcised and the unclean will never invade you again. In Isaiah 61:10, the prophet declares, I will rejoice greatly in Adonai. My soul will be joyful in my God, for he has clothed me with garments of salvation. He has wrapped me in a robe of righteousness, like a bridegroom wearing a priestly turban, like a bride adorning herself with her jewels. There's also the prophetic message from Zechariah 3. Now Joshua was wearing filthy garments and standing before the angel, who answered and spoke to those standing before him, saying, remove the filthy garments from him. Then to Joshua he said, see, I have removed your iniquity from you and will dress you with fine clothing. Were his garments actual iniquity? No. It's not meant to be a physical thing, right? In 2 Corinthians 5:2, Paul says, for this, in this we groan, longing to be clothed with our heavenly dwelling. Some translations will say our habitation from heaven, right? This is a reference to the resurrected body. And of course, 1 Corinthians 15:53, for this corruptible must put on incorruptibility, and this mortal must put on immortality. This phrase, put on, this word in Greek, it's the same one where you see someone putting on a garment. He put on his outer garment. He put on this. He put on that. If you put something on, you wear it. It's the same word. So being clothed with Messiah. In my view, I believe Paul is drawing from the physical image of actually being clothed, right, to teach the spiritual lesson. He's drawing on the image of going into the waters and being immersed and coming out in newness of life and being clothed with Messiah, putting on the attributes of Messiah, those things which are evidenced by the fruit of the Spirit. Now to verses 28 and 29. There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Messiah Yeshua. And if you belong to Messiah, then you are Abraham's seed, heirs according to the promise. Just as he has been telling the Galatian people that they don't need to become Jews to be saved in order to inherit the promises of Abraham. In these two verses, Paul revisits that once again. He opens the passage by saying that there is neither Jew nor Greek, a clear reference to how the Galatians were being told that God was a respecter of persons, right? He won't accept you as a Greek. He won't accept you as a non-Jew. You have to become a Jew. That Greeks could not be accepted, that they must convert to join the covenant. The next phrase refers to slave or free, followed with male and female. This once again refers to inheritance. In the first century, slaves were not entitled to an inheritance from their masters. If a slave possessed something, it was officially the property of his master. And if he had children who were also slaves, they didn't get an inheritance either. Similarly, women in the ancient world were often not included in the granting of inheritance either. This, of course, brings to mind the story of Numbers 27, the daughters of Zelophehad, right? This established a case law about a man's inheritance. It would pass to his daughters if there was no son to inherit it. Why was this necessary? Why did this case even come up? And they come to Moses and say, Moses, what about us? Right? Because the ancient world would have passed over the women in the first place. In classical Athens, if a man had no sons, the oldest son of his oldest daughter would inherit, not the daughter, her son. Paul uses these words here and these phrases intentionally to span the breadth of the various social orders. Just as he is constantly telling the Galatians throughout this letter, they don't need to become Jews in order to be saved, so too women and slaves have an inheritance in the house of Abraham. You do inherit, even if Roman law says you don't. Now, Craig Keener notes the parallel between two ancient sayings. One is a 2nd century rabbinic phrase, which may likely have been taken from an earlier source. And it says, 3 blessings occur at the beginning of morning prayers, and these should be, blessed be he that did not make me a Gentile, blessed be he that did not make me a slave or an ignorant peasant, and blessed be he that did not make me a woman. The counterpart to this is a Greek saying. It's recorded in a story about a Greek sage thanking the goddess Fortune, right? Tyche. He thanks her saying, thank you that I was born as a human and not a brute. This is a reference to lesser beings. Some translations will actually say beasts. He says, thank you that I was not born one of the brutes, that I was born a man and not a woman, and that I was born Greek and not an uncivilized barbarian. In both of these and other ancient phrases, we see a shared disdain for lower social classes. Hence why Paul uses them in this example. And it's fascinating that he uses them in the exact same order: slave and free, Jew and Greek, male and female. Amen. He uses these as an example to say that everyone from the top of your perceived social order to the bottom of it is a child of Abraham, regardless, as long as they are messiahs. And to the Galatians, who themselves likely, in this scenario, as we talked about in the introduction, are the actual ethnic Galatians, the Gauls, right? People that were viewed as low class, lesser than, uncivilized, basically barbarians to the Roman mind. Right? You, who the Romans consider lesser, you, Gentiles, whom the Jews consider lesser, even you are an inheritor. Even you have an inheritance in Abraham. In relation to the first century household, a slave no longer needs to be freed in order to legally obtain this inheritance. Right? Even if you are a slave your whole life, you live and die as a slave, you are still able to be saved. Similarly, a woman need not rely on the piety of her husband or father to determine whether or not she can inherit the promise of Abraham and whether or not she has standing before God. This was a countercultural idea, but one that Paul stresses, and it's part of the new creation. We can link these ideas by Paul's reference just a moment ago to immersion, baptism, right? It's this language of death, life, creation, new creation. Now to wrap up chapter 3, let me briefly hit the highlights really quick of how these things sort of fit together for just a moment. And then again, next week we will begin chapter 4. The Galatians, and indeed all non-Jewish peoples, were brought into covenant by trusting God. This is what Paul tells them, right? You're already here. You're turning away from what you already had. That's how he starts chapter 3. They are already brought into covenant by trusting God, not by their own efforts and evidences of outward ritual conversion by Torah keeping. The Torah was never meant to be used for that purpose. It was a guardian to keep the people, to protect the people, to train the people, to lead them to the goal of maturity. And what is that goal? Messiah Yeshua. This was the promise to Abraham, and it is based on the promise, not based on one's own commandment keeping, as Paul reiterates as well. This includes everyone who is of faith. Numerous times Paul uses sonship language in Galatians 3 and 4, as we'll go into. And numerous times he speaks of inheritance because that's the crux of the issue. Does one become an heir of Abraham, an inheritor of the promise of the gospel by conversion to Judaism and outward expressions of law-keeping? His answer is no. One becomes an heir of Abraham in the same way that Abraham received the promise by faithful trust in God. Here again, we conclude with an eye towards application. Not just what have we learned, but how can we be changed by what we've learned. For this, I want to highlight verse 27 once again. Right? We were immersed into Messiah Yeshua. We are clothed with Messiah. This sort of reaches back to the Fruit of the Spirit series and somewhat we've looked at in this Galatians series a bit already. But here's what you need to ask yourself. How am I dressed? Right? Are you clothed with Messiah? Do you look like it? Okay? Not some self-righteous view where we think we're all that in a bag of gelatin-free gummy bears, but an honest and introspective look. When you receive criticism, especially from those that are close to you, your spouse, your parent or child, your close confidant, right? Do you consider that criticism? Do you argue with them about it? Do you get defensive and deflective? That's not to say that just because someone criticizes you, they're right and you're wrong, but we are most often the most biased and untrustworthy witness when it comes to ourselves. We're not always fair witnesses or judges when we feel criticized. If you are in Messiah, you are a child of Abraham. You have an inheritance from on high, but you also have work to do. You have to dress the part, not just for show, but in sincerity. Becoming a child of Abraham is a matter of faith, trust, or as I prefer, loyalty or allegiance to the king. But if you are a part of a royal family, then you must act like it. What sort of king would you like to have ruling over your nation? Selfish and narcissistic one? One who refuses to listen to criticism, who turns away from his advisors? Or a humble king who serves his people? Our exemplar is Messiah Yeshua, King of all kings, the ultimate ruler. A humble servant just as much as a ruling warrior. You see, most often in this movement, we want to be dressed for battle. That's what we want to be dressed like. We want to put on armor and take up swords and join the king in the slaughter of his enemies. That's how we want to be clothed, royal soldiers in battle armor and a royal sash signifying our status, but rarely do we want to be clothed in the rags of humility. With a towel sash of the lowest servant performing foot washing for the master's guests. I'm not being judgmental here, I'm talking to me. I would encourage you once again to revisit or check out, if you haven't yet, the series where we went through Peri Haruach, the fruit of the Spirit. If your life is clothed with Messiah, the fruits of the Spirit, the work of God in your life will be evident, not just to you, but to others. Amen.